Welcome to the Pardes channel. Today, we explain Prophet Samuel 1, chapter 2, in a clear and simple way, step by step. All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Chapter 2 is honestly a masterclass in storytelling. It takes us back and forth between two very different paths, giving us this incredible contrast between a humble servant and a deeply corrupt family. Now, to give you an idea of the stakes here, before Jerusalem was the established center, the sanctuary at Shiloh was the absolute heart of worship for the entire nation. And right at this holy center, we're seeing these intense opposing forces. On one hand, we have young Samuel, completely devoted and pure. On the other hand, we have the established religious leaders of the day, literally abusing their power. So, here's how we're going to break this down today, going verse by verse so we don't miss a single crucial detail. We'll start with part 1, a brief context. Then part 2, Hannah's prayer of praise. Part 3 covers the sins of Eli's sons. Part 4 looks at Samuel's faithful service. Part 5, the prophecy against Eli. And finally, part 6, we'll wrap up with some practical life lessons. Okay, part 1, brief context. Let's set the scene. To really understand what's happening, we need to remember exactly where we left off in the story. We are at the sanctuary in Shiloh. Hannah, who had endured years of heartbreaking barrenness and just cruel mockery from others, has finally brought her deeply desired son, Samuel, to the priest Eli. She had made a solemn vow that if God gave her a child, she would dedicate him entirely to the Lord for his whole life. Fulfilling that promise carried an immense emotional weight. Just imagine giving up your only son out of sheer gratitude. So Elkanah, her husband, and Hannah leave the boy there in Shiloh with Eli the priest, and they head back to their home in Ramah. The child is now permanently placed in the sanctuary to grow up in the service of God. Moving right into part 2, Hannah's prayer of praise. The chapter immediately kicks off with one of the most powerful prayers in the entire text, spanning verses 1 through 10. You see, instead of just walking away sad that she had to leave her son, Hannah burst into this prophetic song of immense gratitude and deep theological truth. Her prayer starts by declaring her absolute joy and triumph in God, recognizing him as the ultimate source of strength and salvation. She says, "My heart exults in the Lord, my horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth is enlarged over mine enemies, because I rejoice in thy salvation." Now you might be wondering about that word, horn. It's an ancient symbol for strength and dignity. She's essentially saying, I am victorious and my strength is lifted high entirely because of God. She goes on to declare that there is none holy as the Lord, and importantly, there is no rock like our God. She even warns people against speaking with arrogance, because the Lord is a God of knowledge and he weighs all human actions. Do you notice the major theme here? It's all about these massive, sweeping reversals. In verses 4 through 8, she lists these monumental shifts to show that God has the supreme power to give life, to send poverty or wealth, and to completely reverse human fortunes. She points out that the bows of the mighty warriors are literally broken, while those who stumbled are suddenly given strength. Those who were full of food now have to hire themselves out just for a piece of bread. But the hungry? They hunger no more. She specifically notes her own personal miracle. The barren woman bears 7 children, while the woman with many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap to actually seat them with princes. And finally, in verse 10, she declares that those who oppose the Lord will be shattered, and the Lord will judge the ends of the earth, exalting his anointed. That takes us to part 3, the sins of Eli's sons. So in verses 12 through 17, the tone of the chapter shifts drastically. It turns to describe the wicked sons of Eli the priest. The text very bluntly calls them base fellows. In Hebrew, the term is b'nai Belial, which is often translated as sons of Belial. This literally implies men who are worthless, or men who have completely thrown off the yoke of heaven. They did not know the Lord. The text tells us these men had absolutely zero regard for God, treating the sacred offerings with total contempt. Here is exactly what they were doing. When an Israelite came to offer a sacrifice, there were specific rules they had to follow. The fat was supposed to be burned first as an offering exclusively for God. But Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, would send a servant with a 3-pronged fork while the meat was boiling, and whatever the fork brought up, the priest just kept for himself. And it gets worse. They would approach the worshiper even before the fat was burned, demanding raw meat so they could roast it. If the worshiper politely asked to just let the fat burn first according to the law, the servant would say, "No, hand it over right now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." The text tells us in verse 17 that this sin was very great in the sight of the Lord, because they were scorning and treating the Lord's offerings with utter disrespect. Now part 4, Samuel's faithful service. In verses 18 through 26, the narrative starts weaving back and forth between these corrupt priests and the pure growing boy. This structure really forces us to see the glaring difference between the two. While Eli's sons were out there stealing, Samuel was quietly ministering in his linen ephod. Now, an ephod is a special priestly garment, and the fact that even as a young boy Samuel is wearing it signifies his true, pure dedication. The text notes this beautiful, heartbreaking detail. His mother Hannah would make him a little robe and bring it to him year to year when she came up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Because of Hannah's immense sacrifice, Eli the priest would bless Samuel's parents, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." And God was incredibly gracious to Hannah. She conceived and eventually gave birth to 3 more sons and 2 daughters. And all the while, the boy Samuel continued to grow up in the very presence of the Lord. The crucial point we really need to grasp is this intense contrast. We have absolute corruption on one side and pure, faithful devotion on the other. But the corruption of Eli's sons, it gets even worse. Verse 22 tells us that Eli was very old, and he heard about everything his sons were doing to all of Israel, including how they were sleeping with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. It wasn't just theft anymore. It was complete moral depravity happening right at the most holy sanctuary. Eventually, Eli does try to rebuke his sons for their horrible actions, but his words are just so weak, and they completely refuse to listen, ultimately sealing their own fate. Eli says to them, "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, it is not a good report that I hear spreading among the Lord's people." He then lays down a very serious theological truth for them. If a man sins against another man, God may mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him? He is warning them that their crimes aren't just civil disputes, they are direct offenses against the creator of the universe. But tragically, the text states they did not listen to their father's rebuke because the Lord intended to put them to death. And right after this dark and heavy verse 26 chimes in to tell us that the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with men. This leads us to part 5, the prophecy against Eli. Starting in verse 27, a mysterious man of God arrives to deliver a devastating judgment against Eli's entire house. We are never given the name of this prophet, but his message is crystal clear and incredibly severe. The prophet breaks his message down systematically, directly confronting Eli for getting fat on the best parts of the offerings while completely turning a blind eye to the blasphemy. First, the prophet reminds Eli that God clearly revealed himself to his ancestors back in Egypt under Pharaoh. God specifically chose his family out of all the tribes to be priests, to burn incense, and to wear the ephod. God provided for them by giving them the fire offerings. Then comes the accusation in verse 29, and listen to the tone here. "Why do you scorn my sacrifice and offering? Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by my people Israel?" Eli is held directly responsible here. Why? Because he allowed his sons to steal, and he personally benefited from their theft, literally growing fat on the stolen meat. This single verse perfectly captures the divine rule being enforced in this chapter. God tells Eli that even though he had promised that Eli's house would minister before him forever, he is now revoking that privilege. The rule is simple and uncompromising. God honors those who honor him, and those who despise God will be disdained and brought low. Notice how this perfectly echoes exactly what Hannah sang about back in verses 1 through 10. The prophet is basically enforcing the exact rules Hannah praised God for. Because Eli and his sons despise the offerings, the punishment is drastic. The prophet announces that God will cut short Eli's strength and the strength of his father's house. There will not be an old man in his family line forever. His descendants will die in the prime of life, weeping and grieving. And the man of God gives a chilling sign that this prophecy is going to come true. Both of Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will die on the exact same day. That future event is going to be the undeniable proof that this judgment is from God. The prophet ends his message in verse 35 by saying that God will raise up for himself a faithful priest, one who will actually do what is in God's heart and mind. God will build him a firm house, and he will minister before God's anointed forever. Anyone left in Eli's family will eventually have to come and literally bow down to this new priest, just to beg for a piece of silver and a morsel of bread. Let's move to our final section, Part 6, Practical Life Lessons. After walking through these incredibly heavy historical events, we really have to look at how this applies to us. These ancient texts aren't just history, they're blueprints for our own behavior. So, how do we take the literal events of Samuel, Eli, and his sons and use them to improve ourselves today? Because the step-by-step unraveling of Eli's family offers some incredibly sharp warnings. This text teaches us that we can never, ever take God's blessings for granted. We must correct wrongdoing in our homes, and we must serve with the quiet humility of Samuel. Think about Hophni and Phinehas. They were born into the priesthood. They were deeply entitled. They just assumed the rules didn't apply to them, and it led straight to their destruction. Furthermore, Eli's failure shows us the necessity of real correction. Sure, Eli spoke words of rebuke, but words of correction mean absolutely nothing without the action to back them up. He took no action to stop the abuse or remove his sons from power. He honored his sons above his principles and his God. Conversely, look at Hannah and Samuel. They approached God with zero entitlement. Hannah gave her only son back to God out of sheer gratitude, and Samuel served faithfully in the background, growing in favor precisely because he was humble. To recap the whole story, this entire chapter is really a masterclass in contrasts, proving that true power and favor come from honoring God, not from abusing your authority. It starts with Hannah singing a beautiful prophetic song about how God brings down the arrogant and raises the poor from the ash heap. And by the end of the chapter, we see exactly that happening in real time. The powerful, arrogant, firmly established house of Eli is doomed to be brought low, while the humble servant boy Samuel is steadily being raised up to become the spiritual leader of the entire nation. Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.